There's nothing worse than getting up in front of an audience that's completely silent and you're like, they already don't want to be here, right? But you all seem like you very much want to be here. So thank you so much for bringing that energy into the room and for actually being here. My name is Wiley Cash. I am the alumni, author, in residence here at the university. And part of the work I do here is to curate the Common Word Community Read, which is why we are all here. The goal of Common Word is to bring the university and the local community together around a single text in the fall, one text in the fall and one text in the spring. Our text for the fall is Hell of a Book. This is the hardcover. Here's the paperback by North Carolina author Jason Mott. It won the National Book Award in 2021, and he was up here with us this summer for the Ideas Fest on a panel, a literature and humanities panel. The novel is an intense novel about police violence, about discussions of race within families and communities, and it is also a slapstick comedy about an author on book tour. And if it seems impossible to fit all of those things into one book, in some ways it is also an impossible book to turn away from once you engage with it. It's been described as a fever dream of a novel. If you want to find out more about the book itself and look at some discussion questions that we've got online, you can go to unca.edu/commonword. Find the list of events there. We have another event coming up Monday, November 7th at 7 p.m. right here, led by Blue Buchanan, who is kind enough to be in the audience this evening. That talk is going to be titled, or is titled, Sediments of Transit, America's Foundation in Anti-Blackness. We have several other literary events coming up on campus that I want to make everyone aware of. We have an evening with poet Torrin A. Greathouse on Thursday, October 20th at 7 p.m. down in the Highsmith Center in the Blue Ridge Room. We also have an evening with essayist John Jeremiah Sullivan. He's best known for his essay collection Pulphead, which came out a few years ago. He's written for the New Yorker, Paris Review, New York Times Magazine. That will be November 8th, which is also a Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the Highsmith Union's Blue Ridge Room. And our spring selection of the Common Word Community Read, we always try to do something regional in the spring. This past spring, we chose The Last Castle about the Biltmore House. Denise Kiernan, a local author, writing about the Biltmore House. The spring selection in 2023 is The Other Dr. Gilmer, Two Men, a Murder, and an Unlikely Fight for Justice by Dr. Benjamin Gilmer. Some of you who have been in the area for a while may remember the case, the Gilmer case. This book has been described as mesmerizing by the New York Times Book Review. It's a true story about a shocking crime and a mysterious illness that will forever change your notions of how we punish and how we heal. An expansion on one of the most popular This American Life episodes of all time. The author, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, is a family medicine physician in Fletcher, North Carolina. He's an Albert Schweitzer Fellow for Life, an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine at Chapel Hill. That small university that's downstate somewhere. But tonight we are here to enjoy a lecture and hopefully a little bit of conversation afterwards by Dr. Megan Underhill. Dr. Underhill earned a PhD in sociology from the University of Cincinnati. Since then, she has been employed as an associate professor of sociology here at UNC Asheville, where she teaches courses on race and racism, social inequality, and social and cultural theory. Her research focuses on understanding how white parents communicate ideas about race, racism, and whiteness to their white children. Her recent publications include Parents of the White Awakening from 2022, and perhaps the best essay title ever, I Hate the Food Line, Grocery Shopping, Racial Capitalism, and Everyday Disinvestment. And you know it's particularly Southern because it's the food line, right? I'm going to the food line if you need anything. Tonight's lecture is titled Keeping Our Children Safe, Contextualizing the Racial Socialization Practices of Black and White Families. I want to introduce Dr. Megan Underhill.
Okay. So here's the first thing that I want you to do. I want you to take a look at these little faces, right? And I want you to remember the last time that you encountered a baby, right? And maybe that baby was your baby. And I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to remember how it felt with that baby, right? With that baby that might have been your baby, maybe it was your cousin's baby. And I want you to send out all those feelings that you have towards that baby. And I want you to think about what those feelings are. Here's what I bet. I bet some of the things that you're thinking about sending out to that baby are love. I bet that you're hoping that baby, maybe that baby is your baby, is going to have a good life, right? And that other people around that baby are going to help that baby have a good life, right? These are the things that we hope for the children in our world. And hopefully these are the things that we want not just for our children, but for everybody's children, right? And so one of the things that Jason Mott engages with in this work is questions of keeping children safe, right? Is it equally likely or possible to keep all children safe? And what Jason Mott really engages with, and what scholars of race and racism also engage with, is the fact that it isn't, right? Because fundamentally what children are born to in the United States, they're born into a racialized world, right? They're born into a world that is stratified according to race, and that is organized according to a logic and laws of white supremacy, right? And so what this means is that when parents welcome these babies that they love into the world, right, they have to contend with the world. And the world is not providing us all with the same reception, right? And the reception that babies and children are receiving is also racialized. But all parents try. All parents try to keep their children safe. So, in this beautiful book, hell of a book, right? One of the things that Jason Mott is really interrogating is, what does it mean to be born into an anti-black world when you are black? And so, how do we know that this world is characterized by anti-blackness? We have tons of empirical evidence to support this, right? This is not an opinion, this is a fact. So what I want to do now is share with you some of these facts that communicate to us that we are organized according to anti-blackness in the United States. One piece of evidence that we have is from a really amazing researcher named Philip Atiba Goff. And Philip Atiba Goff is a psychologist who goes out and studies implicit bias, among other things. And from a huge study, composed of a huge sample, one of the things that Philip Atiba Goff found with his other partners is that adults do not view children the same. They do not view children the same. So how they view white children is that they extend white children protections, right? They see white children as children. And white kids born into the world get to be kids for a lot longer than black children, whom white people do not see as kids for very long, right? They see them, they adultify them. And this has all these really serious repercussions for children who are black, who are born into the United States. So I want to share with you what some of these repercussions are that create these inequitable outcomes and these very different experiences of childhood, right, and of what it means to be a parent raising a kid that you love. So we know from research that black children are subject to much higher rates of disciplinary action in schools. This isn't just something out there, this is here, right? We see this when we look at outcomes of disciplinary action in Asheville city schools. This creates a problem, right, when you're marked as a troubled kid. This also means, this is related to this, that we also have much higher rates of black children who are involved in the juvenile justice system, right? And many of these children are also tried as adults. This leaves a mark on you, right? Not only does it leave a mark on your soul, but it leaves a mark on your record, such that when folks are going out into the world trying to create a world for themselves, they're discriminated against by employers, by housing, etc. These children right, are also more likely to be tried as adults. Again, this increases the longevity of that mark that people are trying to contend with. This is especially so in the state of North Carolina, right? We have some of the highest rates of children, black children, in the juvenile justice system of anywhere in the country, of any state in the country. And black people in general are also at higher rates of experiencing police violence, right? So black people in the United States, in particular black men, are 3.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than white Americans. Okay, so again, I want you to reorient yourself and think about those babies. Think about those babies, right? And think about the experience of having one of those babies and raising it in a world that is structured according to anti-blackness. So one of the things that Mott talks about in his work, in this book, is that black parents are trying to raise their kids in this anti-black world, and what they experience very profoundly is what Mott calls the fear, right? They experience the fear, and this shapes and guides the decisions that they make as parents. And so I'm going to read you this quote from Mott. He says, "That's what the fear really came down to. That's what all of those other fears were derived from. For people of a certain skin color, living in a certain place, but it wasn't just a fear. It was the truth. A truth proven time and time again for generations. A truth passed down through blood and myth and mandate from lip-to-lip legislation. Certain bodies don't belong to its inhabitants. Never have, never will again. A persistent, inescapable, and terrific truth known by millions of unsettled bodies. The fear." So Mott talks about this, but this is very much rooted in the reality and the history of the United States, because certain people's bodies haven't always belonged to them, right? Here's another quote from Mott describing this fear, right? This fear that Mott argues all black Americans live with. And again, this is something that is shaping parents, the decisions parents are making. So this is the author, and the author is saying, "My whole life I've been afraid. I've been running. I can't remember anything else." Same goes for him. He's talking about the kid, right? And I know it that he and I are the same. Me and everyone who looks like me are the same. We will all carry that same weight. We all live lives that are hanging under a sort of fear. We are buried under the terror that our children will come into all of the same burden and be trapped just like us. Just like us. Okay. And they want to keep their children safe. So, what I want to talk to you about now is the different ways that black and white parents try to keep their children safe in this country that is organized according to the logic and laws of white supremacy, wherein anti-blackness is the norm. So I want to start by talking to you about what black parents do, right? The decisions that black parents do, how they go about navigating the subject of race and racism with their black children. And so the things that I'm going to mention are supported by empirical evidence, and they're also things that Mott explores in this wonderful book. So I want to talk to you in particular about 4 practices that we know that black parents pursue based upon empirical evidence, but that Mott also talks about. And so these are preparation for bias, right? Black parents have the talk. Black parents also try to instill racial pride. In the case of the character in Mott's book, the kid, they try to foster invisibility. And there's also a push to assimilate to whiteness. So I want to explore each of these a little bit more in depth and provide examples from the text. Okay, so one thing that black parents have to contend with in this anti-black world is how in the world do you prepare your sweet baby for the fact that bad things are going to happen to them, right? Or they're going to happen to things that look like people like them, right? And so what black parents have had to do, what they've been compelled to do, is to have this talk with their kids. So I want to read to you this quote because it really contextualizes what that must feel like to be compelled to have this talk with your children. So this is the author from Hell of a Book talking about this. He says, I can still remember when my folks had this talk with me. The old man was on the edge of breaking into tears, and my mother was on the edge of rage. They both, in their own way, felt like they failed me. But they had lied to themselves. They had ignored the fact that from the moment I came out with all of this black skin, the world was already turning its blades against me. The traps had already been set. The walls had already been built. The schools, the prisons, the self-hatred. It had all been done before I ever showed up, right? So parents have to have this conversation with their kids so that their kids will have an understanding of how to negotiate this, right? Interactions with the police to stay safe, but also how to hold on to value and worth and not sink into despair when you have these dangerous interactions. To combat that, though, right, Black parents also have to emphasize racial pride, right? So in the book, one of the ways that Mott talks about Black parents doing this is that they read their children the Ebony Encyclopedia, right? And the Ebony Encyclopedia presents kids with stories and images of successful Black people, right, who've accomplished important tasks in society, or tasks that society deems important, right? And this is important, folks, because as Mott talks about, and hopefully as you've noticed walking in your lives, we don't get a lot of positive depictions of Black people being contributors. We don't get that, right? Our society, as a result of being structured according to white supremacy, means that for white people, there's tons of images and stories being told about and by people who look like you doing great things. But because this doesn't really happen for Black people in general, right? It is incumbent upon parents to have these conversations with their children. In the book, one of the things that was most striking and poignant and sad to me was that the kid, the character is called the kid, what his parents teach him is how to be invisible. And literally what they mean is that if I'm going to keep you safe, I need people not to be able to see you. And if they can't see you, you won't be marked, right? You won't be marked, you won't be stereotyped, and you can live free. You can be free. And so here is an excerpt from Mott's book talking about this. And he says, I know why your mom taught you to be invisible. She wanted to protect you. You being who you are, it's hard. We get shot and put in jail. It's all we see. It's all we know. Our whole story is pain and loss and slavery and depression, and it defines us. And it seeps into our skin, and we bleed it even as we're covered by it. Right? So there's an interesting thing about thinking about this concept of invisibility in Mott's work. And I want to point out two things about this concept of invisibility. One is the reality of Black invisibility in American life. And what I want to really emphasize here is that Black Americans are both hyper-visible in American society and also invisible, right? Invisible without doing anything, right? And so first I want to talk to you about how they're hyper-visible, right? All folks of color are racially marked, right? They're deemed the other. So they are hyper-visible in all spaces. This is a master status for them. It's not something that you can opt out of, right? And this master status, race, Blackness, is associated within the context of the United States with inferiority and danger. So what this means for Black individuals is that they never have the opportunity to just be George, right? They're always the Black guy, George, right? They're always lumped in and associated with other members of their racial group. This is totally different from white people. Right? I, having been born into the world as a white person, have the opportunity to just be Megan. I'm not constantly associated with other white people and with their actions and their history, etc. So for Black people then in the United States, one of the consequences of their hypervisibility is that they themselves become invisible. We don't hear stories about individual people, about their experiences or accomplishments. We don't provide folks of color and Black Americans with the opportunity to be able to discuss something that is unique just to them. Just to them. So here's an example of this from the book. In this book, the author is on the book tour. He lands in San Francisco. He's picked up by his handler, a nice guy named Rennie. And while he's in San Francisco traveling around, there's a Black Lives Matter protest because a little kid, the kid, who's 10, has just been shot and killed by the police, right? And so there are people that have taken to the streets and they're protesting this. And the author is on the book tour. And he's not participating in the protest. When he's on the book tour, he's not talking about the protest or the kid, right? He's distancing himself from this. And his handler, Rennie, chastises him for this. He says, you're not supposed to just stand there. You're supposed to talk about the Black condition. You're supposed to be a voice, right? This is how Black people are rendered invisible. This is how we render Black people and the Black experience invisible. And then the author says, a voice? The voice of my people always? Every second, every day of my life? That's what Black people are supposed to be? I mean, white writers don't have to write about being white. They can just write about whatever books they want. But because I'm Black, does that mean I only ever have to write about Blackness? Am I allowed to write about other things? Right? Okay, so we have these mixed messages that we send as a society to Black individuals, and these are messages, again, that parents are trying to contend with. Another message that the characters in Jason Mott's book receive is one pushing towards white assimilation, right? And this is a message that is advanced in the book by some of the characters, in particular by the kid's grandfather, Daddy Henry. But this is a message that we advance in society today, right? When we have things like dress codes, or we talk about some speech being better or more appropriate than others. So, in this instance, the author has gone to visit his grandpa. His father has taken him to go visit his grandpa, and they're estranged. The father, William, is estranged from the grandpa, Daddy Henry. And it's unclear why at first. Daddy Henry takes out these photos, though, these pictures that William had drawn as a kid, and Daddy Henry says to the kid, I want you to see what your dad could do. I bet he's never shown you these pictures. These are the most amazing pictures that you'll ever see. And all these beautiful pictures that he pulls out of these box are of white people. They're all of white people. And William, the dad, is so ashamed and upset that his father has shown him these pictures. And so here in this quote, we have Daddy Henry talking about this to the kid. And he says, he tried to draw Black people a couple of times, but I put a stop to that. Wasn't no future in that. Still ain't. I was trying to secure a future for him. He could have been a rich man drawing white people, but he quit. He goddamn quit. And then he grew up and he started hating me for it. Said I made him hate Black people, right? So, again, this is another force that Black parents have to contend with and sometimes also pursue, is this idea that, hey, if you do want to get ahead, because we do live in a society organized according to white supremacy, you need to assimilate to whiteness, even if that means letting some of yourself go. Okay, so these are some of the protection strategies that are racialized, right, that Black parents pursue to keep their kids safe. And white parents also pursue racialization strategies with their kids that are also intended to keep their children safe. And they're very different. Before telling you what these are, I want to have us think of a James Baldwin quote here, right? So James Baldwin says that white children in the main, and whether they are rich or poor, grow up with a grasp of reality so feeble that they can very accurately be described as deluded about themselves and the world that they live in. And what Baldwin means by this is that white children have no grounding or understanding of race. They have been deluded, and the delusion is coming from parents and it's coming from the world. Again, if you grow up in a world where everywhere you turn you see images of yourself, and these images are positive and affirming, you don't think about points of difference, right? You don't think about other people's experiences. And all of this is exacerbated by what we know about what white parents do as relates to race and teaching their kids about these things. So I'm going to focus on the top three, which is silence, colorblindness, and denial. Again, and what I want us to be thinking about the whole time are the consequences of these actions, which also are designed to protect white kids. So this was a study that was conducted in 2019, wherein a little over 6,000 parents were interviewed, right? And so they interviewed Black, Asian, Hispanic, and white parents. And what we can see from this graph here is that only 6% of white parents often talk to their kids about race. 21% sometimes do. So I want you to hold that 27% in your head and compare that to, again, Black parents. Right? So we know from research from lots of different studies, in addition to this one, that white parents are not having conversations with their kids about race. They're also not having conversations with their kids about racism or about their own identity, whiteness, right? Whiteness as an identity, whiteness as a system of power, whiteness as a cultural logic. So, this is a quote from one of the characters in the book, and this is the character who is a police officer who is responsible for killing the kid. And he goes and he meets with the author, and has a conversation with them. And he's really trying to demonstrate to the author that he is not a bad person, that he did a bad thing, but he is not a bad person, right? And so, oh, I'm sorry, this is not that person. He's gone to a publicist. The author's with a publicist. The publicist is like, here, I'm going to tell you how you can sell your books and how you can get ahead, right? And how you can get ahead is that you don't talk about race. Nobody wants stories about that. Nobody wants stories about race, racism, violence, any of that. So here he's talking. This is a publicist to the author on book tour. He says, here's one thing I've learned. When somebody treats you terribly, the last thing that they want is for you to behave as if they've treated you terribly. I punch you in the neck. I don't want you bringing up the time I punched you in the neck. It's your job as the punchee to grin and bear it and treat me like I never did it. Make me feel good. Help me forget the whole neck-punching adventure. It's common courtesy, really. Nobody wants their monstrosities brought up. Okay, so this is Mott addressing this theme, and what I want us to think about is how white parents pursue the same practice. We don't want these monstrosities brought up. And they're not just monstrosities of the past, folks, they're the monstrosities of the present that continue to shape reality now. So, one of the ways that white parents pursue this, in an attempt to protect their children, their white children, for reasons that I'll talk about in a moment, is they pursue this through an ideology and a rhetoric of colorblindness, right? So they say things like, I tell my son that we're all the same. We're all equal. I don't emphasize that black-white thing. I want my kid to not see race. Okay, so this is really the dominant racial ideology for a long time, right? And so this is a racial ideology that's really been praised by a lot of folks because it's based upon this idea that if we say that everybody's equal, everybody will be equal. But the problem with this ideology, and people get really upset when I talk about this, is that it's factually inaccurate, right? It's aspirational. Yes, we want people to be equal. I hope that's true, right? But the fact of the matter is that we just aren't. We just aren't. Our society is absolutely rife with racial inequality. We haven't gotten there yet. The other fallacy of colorblindness is that kids see race, right? We have studies that evidence that children by the age of 3 are already demonstrating preferences towards people that look like them. And this bias continues, right? Not only do people recognize racial differences, but they observe inequities in the spaces in which they're situated. They notice things at school. They notice that there are some kids who are disciplined more than others, right? They notice that there are, etc. You get where I'm going here with this. Okay, so if we tell our kids, white people tell your kids that we're all the same and we're all equal, and we don't intervene here, children make conclusions about why certain kids are the ones who are getting in trouble, about why certain kids are the ones who are disciplined or who have received suspensions, right? And they come to their own conclusions, and these conclusions are decontextualized, right? They're decontextualized. Okay, another practice that we see white parents engage in, and where we're really at a critical moment here, is that white parents deny that this is happening. They deny that there is racism in the United States. They deny and reject the fact that white people have privileges, right? Racial privileges that are generational, right? That these privileges have been built into the laws and policies of our state. So this is the quote from the police officer who's talking to the author, and he is trying to, again, have the author absolve him from the heinous act that he committed. And so here he is denying that there is a problem, right? He is denying the reality of race and racism. And he says, black people, you're angry, and why shouldn't you be? But the thing is, I didn't do it. I didn't do any of it. I wasn't born when all of that slavery shit happened. And you weren't never a slave. You weren't never nobody's property. Me and you, we went to the same school, grew up just as broke, we lived the same life. But I get to carry around all of that guilt? I get to be called an oppressor? I get to be told how everything my ancestors did was terrible? Well, how do I know? How do you know? Wasn't neither of us there. Not you or me. Okay, now this is a quote from the book, but my gosh, we're at a moment where these conversations are being had publicly. And not only are these conversations being had publicly, they're making fundamental changes to the society in which we live politically, right, and in terms of policies that we see in schools. So one of the ways in which we see white denial among parents to protect their kids is through these parents' rights groups that have emerged in the last few years, who are advocating for getting rid of critical race theory from schools, right? And so what these parents have done, these white parents, how they have organized is a pursuit of policy, right? So this is a map showing you about the education efforts as relates to this particular topic across the United States. So the blue is signed into law, the purple is proposed, and the red is failed to pass. I want you to look at all those states that are blue. And what this essentially means is that teachers in these schools are not allowed to talk about racism. They are not allowed to talk about racial inequality in school. They are not allowed to talk about things about like white privilege. And the reason these parents contend is because it makes their kids feel bad. And it's racist towards white people. It makes their kids feel bad. They want to protect their kids. How do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of the silence? How do we make sense of these messages that we're all the same when it's very clear that we're not? Right? It's very clear by looking at outcomes that we don't have the same lives. How do we make sense of the denial? And I'm going to argue that there's 3 ways that we can make sense of why parents pursue these practices and how they are motivated by a desire to protect their kids. So the first one is that, as stated, and as we saw in the quote from the Mott book, white parents don't want to make their kids feel bad about race and racism. They don't want their kids to worry about it, to feel guilty about it, and they don't want their kids to feel bad about being white. Am I an oppressor because I'm white? Am I a bad person? Are all the people in my family bad because I'm white? So we shut that conversation down. We foreclose that discussion. Acknowledging racism, right? If white people acknowledge racism with their kids, it also compels white parents to acknowledge that they occupy a privileged status and that they are members of a racial group. They're not just an individual, right? Which again, the thing that we talked about with Black Americans is that they don't get the opportunity to assert an individual identity. So talking about these systems of inequality then undercuts these individualized notions of identity that white people hold, which is that they don't see themselves as part of a racial group. The third thing is that ignoring race is easier. Ignoring racism in the United States is easier for white parents. It is easier for white people because it allows them to continue on with their lives doing just what they're doing without having to change anything. So I want us to reflect back on this sweet little face. And I want you to come back to all those feelings that you conjured when you thought about a baby. Maybe your baby. Maybe your friend's baby or your sister's baby. Those little toes. Those chubby cheeks. And I want us to think about a path forward. Right? And Mott provides us with some information about a path forward. And here's one of the things that the kid, who's 10, who's experienced, who's been killed by the police, says. And this is what I really want to challenge us to deeply let sink in. And this is the kid who spent most of the book being invisible, right? The skill that his parents taught him to be, which is to disappear. And he says, I'm not asking you to carry it, right? To carry the burden of the guilt that is associated with all the inequity that we see. I just want you to see it. I just want you to see it the way it really is. Just stop ignoring it and look at it. Stop pretending I don't exist. No more jokes, no more looking the other way, no more avoidance. I want you to see me. And what I want us to think about is that we need to see this, right? We're at a critical moment in our country that has endured way, way too long. And we need to start seeing this. So this is from Nelson Mandela, right? And Nelson Mandela says, hey, if we're going to guarantee the safety and security of kids, this isn't just going to happen because people are nice or good-willed. This is going to require collective consensus and public investment. We owe our children, the most vulnerable citizens in our society, a life free of fear and violence. And I think that when we think back to those images of those sweet babies' faces, we can agree, we do owe our children a life free from fear and violence. And we can't place this protection and this need to protect our kids only on the shoulders of parents. So, what I would like to challenge us with in this room and anyone who reads Mott's book is that we need to keep all of our children safe. Right? But keeping all of our children safe, like the kid says, requires that we recognize the problem and that we engage in collective action. So, my last thing that I'd like to ask you about is what will you do to ensure the safety of all of our children? What will you do? Thank you.
What about questions? Will you take questions, Megan, if folks have questions?
Yeah, does anyone have a question? Thank you.
So, Wiley Cash mentioned something about a book, and could you talk about that?
I am writing a book on white parents, and this is not what this is, right? But I am in the process of writing a book on white parents and the practices that they engage in and how they've changed over time. Is that what you were looking for, Keith? Yeah. So if I write it, maybe some of you will read it, and that would be really amazing. Yes?
Do you have any kids at home?
Folks, this is my daughter, and she desperately wants to. So this research is inspired by my daughter Margot, who I wouldn't have started thinking about these things had I not become a parent. And I think that's the other thing to really underscore here is that when folks become parents, these issues become heavier, right? Not only because you're thinking about your own kid, but hopefully the process of having a kid does make you think about all the children in the world who, in some way, are yours, or could be yours, right? Yeah. Hey, Catherine.
So I wanted to ask about on the
the way white parents socialize their children to keep them safe, there's no mention of instilling fear. And I think that could just be, on the one hand, kind of a byproduct of white supremacy, is that it creates a fear of other. But as you know, my daughter at 17 traveled by herself around the world, not all the way around the world, but lots of places in the world. And I was really struck by the number of white parents who I would not have thought would be racist. They didn't seem racist to me. But they used repeatedly the phrase, but she's a white female. Virtual phrase, as a white female. And I was always so mystified by that. I was like, she's so much safer than almost anyone else. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
But that meant a lot to them. So I felt like it must be an explicit thing that people teach.
I think you're right. So at this point, I've interviewed a lot of parents and in a couple different cities, and no one mentions that. But I know from my own lived experience that is a message that is relayed, right? There are certain neighborhoods that are dangerous. You lock your door. You don't go to those neighborhoods, etc. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I'm going to go back through my interviews and look for that, because I think you're right. I think you're right. Lindy, did you have a question?
I did. So, as a fellow sociologist, I really appreciate the ways that you bring sociological theory and data into this conversation. And obviously tonight we're here to talk about Hell of a Book, which is a work of fiction. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about the relationship, the integration between social science and fiction, and the ways that people learn, in particular, the ways that white people who aren't as open to this information might learn from different venues or different ways of experiencing this information.
That is such a great point. So I learned a lot from this book, right? So certainly I have an academic understanding, but you're right. One of the wonderful things about literature is it can take you to a place and an experience that you can't have yourself. In some ways, you can walk in the shoes of another person. And so I think that in the social sciences, we need to better incorporate literature into examining these social issues. I will say that I think it's pretty common for white parents in my study to try to get at these issues of race and racism via books, right? That's where a lot of people are starting, is the anti-racist parents, right? They're starting by reading their kids' books about the civil rights movement or about slavery, and using that as a way to begin this work, doing something that they don't feel like they know how to do, right? These parents don't feel like they know how to do this because their parents either didn't talk to them or were overtly racist, right? So they're trying to build a ship while sail it. And in the process of learning how to do this, they often turned to books. But I think we should turn to books more often. I really love this opportunity that you presented me with, Wiley, of thinking about the marriage between literature and sociology, and I would love to see more of it. Yes?
I noticed that one of the practices of racial socialization that you listed for both Black caregivers and white caregivers was anti-racism, and I recognize that you chose not to talk about it, but I wonder if you might say a little bit about how they would be similar or different from each other.
That's a really good question. Okay, Black parents have always had to be anti-racist, right? They've always had to be anti-racist and talking about racism and engaged in equity work, right? Because they're excluded. So, let's think about all the amazing things. The fact that we have any movement on this issue, right? It is because of Black people. It is because of the anti-racist efforts of Black people. What people in the United States don't typically associate, which is weird, anti-racism with Black people. But where we are now is because of the mobilization of Black individuals, right? And collectivities of folks. And so I think one of the things that's different about anti-racism between black families and white families is, again, that black parents have to do this work, right? They may not want to do the work, right? Just like the parents in this book don't want to do the work. It hurts to do this work. It hurts to do this work when the work is for that sweet little baby, right? But you have to do the work. So for white parents, this is more optional, and it's an emergent identity. And so it's associated with white progressives, which are about 8% of the population, according to studies. And white people are figuring it out, right? So what I've seen in my research about how white parents try to go about practicing anti-racism is, first of all, this is an emergent definition, right? That people are trying to figure out what this means. And for a lot of white people, what this means is that you talk to your kids about race and racism. You talk to them about white privilege. It means that you try to divest from certain practices that are associated with opportunity hoarding, right? It means that you try to be a good ally. You call in people in your family and friends when they're being racist, and you call them out, or try to advocate for folks of color in the spaces that you're in. So these are some of the ways that I've seen you attend rallies, right? These are some of the ways that I've seen white people engage in this, but where I would like to see movement, and I think it'll be hard, and this is what I'm trying to think through, is that for white people who say that they're anti-racist, these are very individualized practices. So very rarely does this anti-racist engagement move beyond the home or beyond white spaces where there's other like-minded white individuals where they're talking about these things. And so it's interesting to think about why that is, and that's something that I'm really pondering. But I think there's a variety of reasons, but it's an individualized practice rather than something that is collectively engaged in, which is what we see in a lot of the Black community, right, among others. Wiley.
I have a question. I'm going to go off what Lindy said, and I'm thinking about, your talk tonight is about how parents talk to children, and I'm listening to how you just wonderfully unpacked this book. It was so beautifully done, how you unpacked the book. And some of my students are here tonight. I taught this book this semester, and I'm like, I didn't do any of that. I spent 2 weeks on this book, and I didn't say any of that stuff, I don't think, as eloquently as she did. But I'm thinking about what Lindy said about how fiction can often broach topics that we don't know how to do scientifically or sociologically. So you're talking about how parents reach out to kids, but how do we reach the parents who don't want their child to read Beloved because it made him feel bad? I'm sure many of us saw that story. And I'm also wondering, there's somebody that I've done some work with down in Wilmington who firmly believes that it's easier to change the directions of institutions than it is to change individuals' hearts. And I'm just wondering about that level of engagement as well, like trying to talk to parents as opposed to try to redirect institutional power with programming or community activity or...
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think parents have to have these conversations with other parents, right? This is part of what anti-racism for white people should look like, is that we hold other people accountable to these things. We invite them in, right, to have these challenging conversations about why these conversations are important, right? And kids are resilient, and you're not going to make your kid feel guilty. And even if they do feel bad, it'll be for a moment, and they'll be okay because they're white, right? They are white. Your kid is going to be fine. And the reason that it is fundamentally incumbent upon white people to have these conversations with their children and for us to have these conversations with our community members is because white people, remain the dominant group in the United States, right? And we are wielding a lot of power, right? And so a practice that white anti-racists can engage in is this work within our own community, right? We have to do this work in our own community, and we have to do this to move it forward, but also because it's not fair to people of color. It's not fair for people of color to have to also do this work within white spaces with white people who might be angry and belligerent or violent, right? So, yeah, and I think, we have these conversations, we individually have these conversations, we create opportunities where these discussions can be had. There are cool things happening in our community in Asheville at schools, right, that teachers are doing. So I wish I could remember this amazing teacher's name. She's at Claxton. She's a 3rd grade teacher. And so one of the things that she does is she has this project for 3rd graders where she makes them do research on the heroes and sheroes of Asheville, right? The heroes and sheroes of color. And so these kids do this, and it's not just about us having conversations about race and racism, which we must have, right? But it's also about having conversations where we're celebrating and elevating Black life in other ways, right? Because as the author says, why do I always have to be tied to this pain and this trauma? Like, why can't I be an individual? I want you to see me. And so these are some other ways that I think we can do it. But I'm still thinking through these things, and I'd love to think through them with you. So, Blue.
Yeah. So I really appreciated the Nelson Mandela quote, right, talking about investment. And we know that parents also often frame their socialization practices as like investments in their children.
Mm-hmm.
We talked, I think so far, a lot about ideas and education. What about are there material practices you would suggest that move beyond just like you need to educate other white people about how to write better, and move towards like what are some material interventions, maybe that either from your work or from stuff that you've read that you would suggest?
Yes, that is a great question. I think there are a lot of material things that need to happen and that we need to do, and it's going to be really hard because white people aren't going to want to do these things. And so we need to integrate schools. Schools are as segregated now as they were when desegregation efforts happened, right? But we also know from research that you put in busing efforts, right, or you redistrict, and white parents mobilize against this, and they get really upset. So I think we need to have things like that. Certainly all of this has to happen at a policy level. So the thing that I'm wondering about, though, and that I really deeply think about a lot is, just as you said, Blue, how do we move from these ideas to policy change? And for most people, this is really hard to wrap your mind around, right? I don't know how to create policy change, right? So this feeling then, what this inspires is people to double down on these individual actions. I'm going to read books. I'm going to talk to my kids. I'm going to call in my friends. I'm going to join a white accountability group. Those things are needed and they're important, but we also need to organize, right? We need to organize and agitate for change within our local communities. I too don't know how to create policy change outside of voting, but I do know that we can do things in our local community via mobilization, right? How to do that part though, Blue, I hope you can help me think through that. Thank you all so much. Thanks so much for coming out. Lexi, okay.
This is not going to draw any emotional labor from you.
Okay.
Just one thing that I have learned about through being able to listen while in Black spaces is work toward, look up, ally versus co-conspirator. And in that, it will teach you how to make the next step. Yeah, it's a big deal. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you, Lexi. Thanks everybody so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Wiley, for inviting me.
Thank you all for coming and for spending the second chilly night of the fall here with us. What better thing than be with friends and talk about books and ideas and change. And also, I got 4 copies of the Hell of a Book to give away. So if you'd like one of these copies, please come up and you can, I'll just put them on the table here. You can grab them and read it and come and see Professor Buchanan's lecture November 7th, same time, same place, 7 p.m. right here. And thank you all so much for coming. I sincerely appreciate it. And Dr. Underhill, that was wonderful.